Good morning, everybody. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland on the D-Day beaches of Normandy. I'm going 7.5 hours later to the gigantic island continent of Australia. And we have on the show today a super wonderful person and a great friend, Mobo Gao. How are you doing, Mobo?
Thank you.
Mobo is in Adelaide. Where is Adelaide in that notch down at the bottom of on the south side of Australia?
Yes.
Yeah. And isn't there a famous river that runs through it? I can't remember.
Famous what?
River.
Darling, Mary Darling.
That's right. They've written songs about that.
Yes.
Unbelievable. Well, anyway, this is the second time I have had Mobo on the show. In the first show, we discussed his first two books, which are The Battle for China's Past, Mao and the Cultural Revolution, and then Gao Village, Rural Life in Modern China. And today we are going to be discussing his newest work, Gao Village Revisited, The Life of Rural People in Contemporary China. And he wrote a great book, co-wrote a great book with Dongping Han and Hao Qi, which I also thoroughly enjoyed, Remembering Socialist China 1949-1976. And I do want to point out that, we're talking to someone who lived in rural China during the entire Mao Zedong era, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And it's very important that we talk to people like Mobo, because he did grow up in the heyday of New China's rapid development and social change. And he, unlike the money-grubbing scar literature writers, Mobo's three books are cool, calm, collected, and fact-filled, back with tons of statistics and real-life experiences in rural communist China, the good and the bad. And today we're going to talk about what happened after the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward in the Mao era. So glad to have you on the show today, Mobo.
Okay. Glad to talk to you, Jeff.
I want to ask you, fans should read all your books, and I have, so I'm obviously a Mobo fan. Fans should read all of your books, but please give us a brief rundown of your upbringing, where, when, and how you ended up being a university professor in Australia. It's a remarkable life story. Go ahead.
Well, I didn't leave the village when I was 20 something, I can't remember exactly. And when there was still no electricity, and I went to study English at Xiamen University. And that was during the Cultural Revolution, when there was no nationwide entrance examination for tertiary education. And the policy was supposed to be affirmative towards the marginalized and the lower class people. So it was called the workers, peasants, soldiers, students. So it was based on recommendation. There was some kind of test exam to test your basic literacy, and but you're supposed to be recommended by the grassroots organizations like the Commune. So I was recommended to be one of them, and then I was selected to go to Xiamen University to study English. After 3 years of study of English, I was asked to be a teacher at Xiamen University of English, and then there was scholarship to study in England. So I was, there was some kind of a competition, but eventually I came out to be able to go to study in England. I studied in England first English, and then master degree, and then PhD After I finished my PhD, I applied for a job in Australia, and that's how I moved to Australia. And then
Okay.
there, I was appointed as a professor of Chinese studies at Adelaide University.
All right, great. So how long have you been in Australia, Mobo?
Since 1991.
Wow, okay, all right. Incredible. When you wrote about your two daughters, in your third book, going back to Gao Village and their impressions, and I'm sure your family has many interesting stories to talk about together. When your book, basically, your first book, Battle for China, is about the Mao era and your let's call it defense of the Mao era. Good and bad. It wasn't perfect, but you cut through all the scar literature and tell a different side of the story about the Mao era. And then the Gao Village, you talk about what it was like during the Mao era and somewhat afterwards into the after that. And then in this latest one, it's like 20 years later. We're now up to in the last 5 years or so. You talk about what's happened since then. So with Deng Xiaoping's post-Mao era agriculture and market reforms, collective farming and the much lauded barefoot doctor program disappeared. How long did the changes take place, and how did rural people adapt? And please explain, because a lot of people may not know what it is, so please explain what collectivization was during the Mao era and how that has been dismantled during the last 40 years, and which side is winning the production model battle these days? Go ahead.
That's a very good question. It will take, I think, a great deal of time to explain or to talk about it in full details. But I'll just
Summarize.
try to summarize in a very short time. One of the things about the year of Mao is that the interpretation of the year of Mao was done by the post-Mao political and intellectual elite. Now, because the China's political and intellectual elite were sort of constantly, especially during the Cultural Revolution, targets of criticism, self-criticism, because that was whole idea of Mao to stop China moving into what he called capitalist society, and Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi was number one, Deng Xiaoping was number two of the capitalist voters. In other words, the leaders who would take China into a capitalist world. So these people it might not be entirely be their own fault because their ideology or their way of thinking did suffer one way or another during the Cultural Revolution, because they were taken out, put on stage to be criticized in public. As that was, by any standard, it was humiliating. And so therefore, they don't like the idea of Cultural Revolution, and therefore the backlash against the Cultural Revolution led them to question the whole idea of Mao's policies in the entire era of Mao. So the post-Mao interpretation that is accepted and also inside China and in the West, it was political, and lots of people don't realize, and then took it as a factual history. So the first Gao Village book was in some way to address this issue, to show that in rural China at least, there was progress, socioeconomic progress, and like education, healthcare, which was echoed by Han Luping's book as well. And also infrastructure like irrigation, reservoirs, and the mechanization even, and new technology, fertilizers, and new kind of rice um, um, seeds, and so on and so forth. So it was by late 1970s, as it was China was on the edge of taking off. And there's one book by an American scholar called the Green Revolution, Technological Innovation during the Common period. So some Western scholars and Chinese themselves now start to realize that the immediate post-Mao interpretation of Mao was not nuanced, was one-sided. And I, of course, wrote a book 30 years ago, and it was published in 1999, already pointed out. So it took a long time for other people to realize that thing. So that's the first thing about the Gao Village book. It's just to show that it was not as bad as as it was portrayed. Now, how come if it was not that bad, that there was a change? There was the so-called reform and the dismantling of the commune. Now that is very complicated, because it's interesting, because as I said in my written answer to you, I did interview Gao villagers about this and talked to my younger brother, who is very literate, educated, and who was one of the village leaders at that time. I said, how come that the collective system was just dismantled like that? And my brother said, we didn't know that the commune was going to be dismantled. And the first they introduced what they called responsibility system. Responsibility system was a kind of a work assignment idea. So say for some kind of complex work, and the production or the commune would assign somebody or assign a family to finish that, and then get and then you will be rewarded according to whether you completed the task. Completed the task. So it was not the idea at the beginning. It was not to dismantle the commune, and that is a kind of a thin end of the edge of the wedge. So it was a design to dismantle the commune by introducing this kind of gradual change, so that people didn't realize that it was taking place.
Mm. And so I think you said they started this responsibility system, what, about 1979, 1980?
They started in 1979, or even later in Gao Village area. They started early in some places. So that's late 70s, early 1980s. By 1984, it was all dismantled, except a few hundred who resisted very, very strongly.
Yeah. Some of which still exist today. So, which is quite fascinating. What happened to the incredibly lauded and emulated barefoot doctor system with the collectivization being dismantled?
Yep, because the whole idea of the barefoot doctor system was based on the collective system. Because so the doctor would see the patients whenever he or she is required, and the idea is that if there's no patient to see, the doctor would be like a farmer, would work like a farmer as well. That's why it's called a barefoot, because you don't wear shoes to work in the field. So if the collective system is dismantled, then the very existence of the barefoot doctor system has had no basis.
Okay.
So then they all become private clinics.
Got it. Yeah, yeah. That sounds about right. All right. The next question. I did. Yeah, you said. Do you want to go ahead and point out? You mentioned in your written answer that they explore the Xiaogang Swin and fabricate stories to legitimize their anti-collective measures, and there were very successful collectives and some failed ones, with many in the middle. Bill Hinton guesses that it's something like 30-30-30. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, this is exactly what an example show what I said before. It was politically designed to dismantle the collective system, and the Xiaogang story was fabricated. And the so-called document with the signature of these people, and actually in his history museum was later a copy, not original one. In fact, the Xiaogang they were not they didn't have a good leadership. And if you recall what William Hinton said, because he was a high-profile expert in rural China during the era of Mao, and he was trusted. He worked very hard, and he went to Dazhai. He traveled all over the places and talked to Zhou Enlai and so on and so forth. So he estimated that about 1/3 of the communes did very well successfully, about 1/3 in the middle, and about 1/3 might be not doing that well. So it's it's kind of 3-3-3.
Yeah. Okay.
Category. So Xiaogang certainly is one of the worst ones, and for this kind of collective system. And also autonomy and independence, you really need a very good leadership. And if the leadership isn't good, it's not going to work. And that's exactly what the Xiaogang did, because they could not keep themselves together. So they wanted to just be household farming. And so the Chinese leadership at that time wanted to use this to show that this dismantling of the commune was voluntary by the farmers themselves to justify their political aim.
And so Xiaogang Swin, these are the decollectivized villages. Is that what those were?
Yeah. And in fact, Xiaogang never really got them out of poverty anyway, even when they dismantled the commune, and they didn't do well either. And so later, in order to prop up the story, to show some of the government and the local government and the central government give them lots of assistance. And in fact, they give the financial systems and also send a high-level cadre to lead them. And eventually, ironically, that cadre died of hard work, and he wanted to re-collectivize China.
I think there's still maybe 100 collectives are still in China. I remember reading an article about it. I think there's maybe 1 or 2, maybe 100 or 200. I can't remember, but and apparently they're doing okay.
Yeah.
Well, since 1980, the battle between China's rural privatizers and collectivists continues to rage on. In 2019, I interviewed Alex Witherspoon and John Hanchar, who were doing field surveys and visited several of the still Mao era villages. It was really interesting. Alex told me that there were laws being discussed in China's National People's Congress to move towards privatization, but at the same time, President Xi gave a policy speech in 2018 to not force any collective to liberalize nor stop any village from going back to collectivization. And in that same part of your book, you talked about how the privatized models of East Asia, such as Taiwan and Japan and Korea, have not fared so well. So just tell us, who's winning. I mean, what's going to happen, and how it's going to play out. You think in the next 5 years, especially with since Xi Jinping was elected president.
Yep. The push for wholesale. At the moment, let me start with what current system is like. The current system is that the land, agricultural land, farming land in rural China is collectively owned by a village, whatever the village inherited from the past. So, and then the village would then divide the land equally on a capital basis to the households. And the households has the use right to produce whatever they want, to sell what they want. So the ownership has two layers of structure. So the collectively owned by the village, and is that the ownership, but the use right is owned by the household. Now, so that's household farming. So that has been since 1984 until now still the case. Now there's economic rationalists like Zhang Weiying and Zhou Qiren and the others, of course. They argue that and the Qing Hui, and they argue that in order to be efficient, productive, and the land has to be thoroughly wholesale owned privately. In other words, they want to abolish the collective ownership. Now, no Chinese leadership has dared to do that for two reasons. One is that the Chinese constitution is written in the constitution. If you want to change that, you rewrite the constitution. And as Communist Party of China, they dare not to do that unless you change the party. And this I described in my book. In many counties, the party secretary wanted to push for this privatization, whereas the People's Congress and chair didn't want that happen because they resort to the constitution, and the party secretaries couldn't do much about that. Now, the first reason the economic rationalists argue for the wholesale privatization of land is that, but the second reason is that if the farmers own their own land, then they cannot be taken away by the developers and property developers. And because there was, for a long time, there was this issue in China, right? The property developers take land, and all the local authorities sell land cheaply, and the property developers make a huge amount of money. But that is a excuse, because the land that can be used commercially are very few in comparison, only in near urban centers.
Yeah, like on the outside of Beijing, or the outside of Nanjing, or the outside of Xiamen.
Yeah. So the vast majority of rural land doesn't have that problem. The fact is that people don't want land anymore, because there was until 2005, land was taxed. And they couldn't produce much to pay the tax, and people wanted to give land away. So there was no such a thing as a property developer grabbing land in the vast area of China. So the Chinese authorities did not you dare to do the first because of the constitution. Secondly, because the collective land ownership is a social security for
Hmm.
hundreds of million people. You see, you don't see ghettos like in the Philippines or Mexico or India, because why? Because when the people, rural people, they go to work in the urban centers. When they have no work, they cannot find work or are fired or dismissed. They could always go back to the home.
Hmm.
There is piece of land for them, at least to produce food for them, so they don't have to stay in urban China homeless and live in ghettos. So that is very important, and is the Chinese, the system was able to provide a surplus labor for the industrialization at no cost of the state at all.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. And of course, if China changed their constitution and allowed the private ownership of dirt or land, I mean, everybody, you can, for those of you who all don't know, the world is different, but in urban areas, I can buy a 70-year, private people can buy a 70-year lease for a house or an apartment or a business or whatever. So there's no private dirt in China. It's all owned by the state, by the people through the state, and through various organizations and companies and government entities and et cetera. So if they privatize that, I think it would be the end of China as we know it. I think it would be an absolute catastrophe if they allowed that to happen. It would end up being another just a continent-sized. Well, first off, if they privatize the rural land, what's going to happen? They're going to go in and they're going to the big multi-billion-dollar agricultural companies are going to just go in and just buy up all that land and dispossess the people that live there. Growing pineapples, in Hainan and growing rice in Guangzhou on, 5,000 hectare, plantations, destroying the fabric of village life. Yeah, mono farming and it would just be a disaster. And so I hope they have the courage. It would be the beginning of the end of China, and it would just turn China into a balkanized Indonesia, to be quite honest.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So let's hope they have the courage to not change the constitution, because it would basically be the end of socialism and communism in China. It'd be over.
Exactly. But there is issue of productivity.
Yeah, I know.
From economics point of view, large-scale farming is more productive.
Of course.
Now, so the economic rationalists want to push that further. Now, the trouble is that if you look at this, you mentioned about Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Okay, Japan is a good example. They started with a small household farming, and then and gradually the farms had been abandoned by the people when the old people passed away, the young people moved away, so no farming at all, or they gradually have large scale farming become more productive. That looks very successful, but now both these areas, these so-called East Asian models of agriculture, the one that Philip Huang, the very well-known scholar, admires, is that these countries, Taiwan, these areas become increasingly dependent on import.
Yeah.
But that is okay for South Korea, Taiwan, or even Japan, but it's not okay for China.
Yeah, 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, too big. And China needs what they call food sovereignty,
Mm-hmm.
food security. they can't depend on export. Now, okay, the thing is, although productivity-wise, the current system is not high compared with America and Japan and so on. However, unit production is higher than America. In other words, 1 acre of land in China, you produce more than 1 acre of land you produce in America. Because in China, it's more labor intensive. So that is how China's food security is sustained. If you go to large scale farming, okay, you might have raised productivity, but you lose lots of food production. And you already this is one of the things Xi Jinping that is very much worried at the moment. Soybean, of course, is entirely dependent on import, and corn as well. At the moment, rice is okay. China can be self-sufficient, and the stable food, the stable grain. So Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership is already worried that China might have already import too much.
Well, the big one for China is soybeans. I mean, they import like 75 million metric tons of soybeans a year because it's a low volume, high value crop, and so it uses up a lot of land, and so it's a lot easier to buy soybeans from Brazil and from the United States, and then grow corn, rice, the heavier, lower cost, more dense, getting more tonnage per acre, per hectare. So, but I don't think they'll ever be able to get away from the, from the soybean predicament. But there's a lot of soybeans for sale on the world market, and there's even Europe, Russia. I mean, there's plenty of places that that sell, plenty of countries that can sell soybeans, and so that's basically been the policy of China, is concentrate on rice, corn, barley, sorghum, the feed grains and rice grain, and then import soybeans. So, all right, I want to ask you. It just seems to me like such an obvious thing. Why don't more villages take President Xi's cue, who said nobody can dare touch a collectivized village. The ones that want to stay that way cannot be attacked. And then if any village wants to collectivize, no one can stop them if that's what the people want to do. Why is that not happening, Mobo?
Because there's still this push for productivity.
Yeah.
The economic rationalism. They were saying, development, in order for China to catch up with the Western countries, to be a developed country, you need to raise productivity. And so in order to do that, they want to push for a kind of what they call the ownership responsibility. In other words, so at the moment, what they're trying to do is they want to lots of provinces and local authorities encourage the entrepreneurs, the so-called entrepreneurs. They give them subsidies for them to what you call purchase the use rights of the farmers, and then say 100, 300 households in Gao Village, and you sell all your land to one person, and the neighboring village, 500 households, you also sell your land use right to the same person.
Not sell the dirt, but sell the rights, the user's rights, not sell the dirt.
Sell the user rights, not the collective rights, but the user rights. Say for 20 years or 30 years. So this entrepreneur, okay, who is supposed to have money and expertise, then would start to farm this two villages land together, and say produce sorghum or soybean, just one crop, and that's supposed to be efficient, supposed to be productive, and they were encouraged to do that. But so far, it's not been successful. Lots of people tried, and many people ended in failure. There
Yeah.
are some successful stories, but not many.
Okay. Well, and it would also that too. If somebody comes in and creates a 500 hectare or 1,000 hectare, soybean farm on all that land that they've patched together, what are they going to? What are the people that live there going to do? I mean, it should, to me, it would just be like a huge disruption to their way of life that has essentially been going on for 5,000 years, and is, other than now, it's socialism and communism, but since 1949. But I don't know. I just don't. It just doesn't seem to me that China is cut out for that kind of. That kind of. I mean, I have seen some huge, areas up like in Jilin and Heilongjiang, where there, lots of, just corn just going off into the infinity. I don't know how those were being done. I don't know if it was a collective or what, but I have seen that.
That's interesting because first of all, you point out the fact that there's geographic differences. In the north, you have large plain, level land, mechanization, whereas in the south you have terraced rice field, very hard for mechanization. It's better suited to small machineries and that kind of things. Now, that's interesting. A point that you get out there. But second point is in Heilongjiang, in all these places, I mean, it was a long time ago. They already rationalized it. Although the farmers, they own the use rights, they have they have boundaries. They know where they are, and they have how much land they own. But they agreed to farm together.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably what it is. Well, in fact, go ahead.
Then you receive the output according to the size of your land you have.
Okay. Got it. Yeah, Liaoning. For those of you who don't know Chinese geography that well, there's Beijing up in the northeast, and then above that is Liaoning and Jilin and Heilongjiang. And Heilongjiang is the massive province that borders eastern Russia, and then Jilin borders North Korea. And Liaoning is the peninsula sticks down towards Japan, so it's way up in the north, and the weather is more like, Canada and northern United States. It's a very cold continental climate in the winter. So, all right, well, that was very, very interesting. When we lived in China, 1990 to 1997, there were already millions of rural people floating around the country and flooding into the big cities to work, mostly in construction. We had thousands sleeping on the streets right outside of our house every night, all up and down the streets. And they were very civil, and they were very polite, and they were very nice. It was a sight to see. I mean, if that had been in the United States, there would have been riots. But these people were very disciplined and very nice. Anyway, after 1978, and then we came back in 2010 until 2019, and we're in China. Of course, we didn't see. They weren't sleeping in the streets then. But there were still a lot of workers. After 1978, how long did it take for this floating population to begin and grow? And even today, it is still estimated at 200 to 300 million rural folk working away from home. And you wrote about this a lot in your last book, Gao Village Revisited, how people would leave Gao Village and oftentimes find tremendous success in faraway provinces. Tell us about that.
Yeah, basically, it's virtually all the young people would leave the villages. So it's about 25 to 30% of the population of village
Incredible.
are away from the hometown. They used to all migrate to work in southeast southern coast, like Shenzhen, Shanghai, and so on and so forth. Now they are more scattered because the development has spread to inland as well as western, northwest, southwest regions, Yunnan, Sichuan, and Xinjiang, and
Xi'an,
and even Tibet. So Xi'an, of course, and therefore but also even in the like urban centers like a county or provincial center like a Nanchang, for instance. So these places started to develop as well, and therefore lots of migrant workers didn't have to travel that far to like they used to.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, and as you said, it's thanks to people that who are from Gao Village and a million other villages all over China. It's thanks to them that they provided the know-how and the backbone and the hard work to make it possible for China to have its incredible economic success in the last 40 years. It's just unbelievable. So thank a Chinese migrant worker for everything that you have.
I'm one of them.
There you go. That's right. All right.
I'm working in Australia.
The impression I get is that China's agricultural sector cannot survive without lots of government subsidies, price supports, and tax abatements. You mentioned that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, capped these so that China could join this international trade body. At the same time, it is well known that the OECD countries, basically the wealthy countries of the West, the OECD countries are also heavily subsidize their farmers and producers. And in the US, most of those taxpayers' billions go to Fortune 500 transnational behemoths like Cargill and ADM and Del Monte and Dole and Pioneer and Monsanto and others. In France, where most of the agriculture is still small scale, they help the family farmers who are widely supported by urbanites as well. Chinese subsidies, I think, seem to go to the little guy too. What is the latest on Chinese ag subsidies, price supports, and tax abatements? And what do the farmers think about them? Will China ever be able to maintain a productive agricultural sector and feed its growing population without them? Take it away.
Yeah. Interesting when China was trying to get into WTO and eventually got into it was the premier was Zhu Longji. Zhu Longji made lots of concessions when he went to visit the United States of America and met President Bill Hinton, and he was expecting to sign the agreement so that China could get in WTO. He made so many concessions, but Bill Hinton wanted to extract more. So eventually, Zhurongji left the United States without signing, and then the United States regretted, and then started negotiations soon again, and eventually they reached agreement, and so China got in. Now, these concessions are so dramatic and so extensive that the Chinese authorities dare not publish it in Chinese. Seriously.
I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that one. That's incredible. Sort of like the Versailles Treaty after World War I.
So one of the some of the concessions is on the agricultural, because China by then was China is still a developing country. Then China was so poor and so such a developing country, and the United States of course wanted Chinese market, so wanted China to make concessions. So one the concessions is to cap the price of Chinese subsidies. And so that cap, it's by year 2005 was already reached. China couldn't go further. And so there was a crisis. I mean, in my first book, there was a crisis in China, rural China. Although in the early 80s, up to 85, there was an increase of income, there was increase of food production, and the rural people happier. And of course, the economic rationalists and the post-Mao political and intellectual elite all claim, this is because of the reform, this is because the dismantling of the common system, of the collective system, and the Chinese peasants are liberated, which is bullshit. And the income of the rural people increased in the early 1980s because they increased the price of agriculture.
Of commodities, okay.
Yes, commodities. And they could afford to do that because they changed the development strategy. From Mao, they had to invest in vast socio-economic programs like education, healthcare, like defense industry, like heavy industry, like rockets, like satellites. They had to do that because it was encircled by hostile forces. So once the relationship once the United States relaxed its hostility towards China, you can shift the development strategy. And that's what actually happened. It's not because of the dismantling of the collective system. Anyway, so after that, after 1985, the input of agriculture, the price caught up, and therefore agriculture became stagnant, and the rural income became stagnant, and plus the tax and everything, and there were lots of grievances. And as I said, described in the first Gao Village book, whenever I went back to Gao Village, it was complain. And of course, they thought I could help. Of course, I couldn't help them. So life was very, very hard. Now, you have to say credit to Hu Jintao. One of the things that was done during his leadership was the abolition of the agricultural tax. And that was the first time in 2,500 years recorded history.
Yeah.
The rural people were not taxed.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that was relief. That was relief and the release for the rural people. Now, at the moment, it's an issue that the Chinese actually, a track record of Chinese obeying the WTO rules are actually very good. So the moment the Chinese cannot subsidize the food in the way they used to do because of its capped, And as I said to you in my written answers, they now started subsidizing the agricultural input
Hmm.
with the chemical fertilizers. And
Yeah, 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 yeah.
if I give you this much money, can you reduce the price?
Yeah, I see. Okay, yeah.
So that is is a way of avoiding the WTO rules.
That's funny. That's smart. I loved your stories like the quote little incident, and I hope people do buy your book and read it because it's really a lot of fun. The little incident and how no lawyers were needed to come to an amiable settlement. I wrote about this too in the China trilogy, and it was even one of the parties. I was either wrong or I was wronged on several occasions over the years, and it, instantaneous local justice. It works right there on the street, on the road, in the park. It works incredibly well and is much quicker and more open than in the litigious West. Yet most foreigners have been brainwashed that Chinese justice is corrupt. How do you respond to ill-informed propaganda like this?
Yep, that's interesting. I'll start with a story of an Australian student. We sent students of Chinese to China to study, and some years ago, there's one student among the group who lost his passport. Now, you can't get into the country without a passport, right? So this student was in deep trouble, and the family was worried, and so what we did, I mean, I wasn't involved, my colleagues involved, is to talk to the university that we are sending the students. The university used this leverage to talk to the customers, to say, look, this student from Australia, alone, family worried, without a passport, what can we do? So the customers, because in order to accommodate the student, to make the student less miserable, allowed him to enter China. Right? Interesting in discussion. And some of them at least say, oh, the Chinese system is corrupt. In Australia, the rule is rule. Without a passport, nobody can enter it. You can't just negotiate to let the student in. You see, this is the thing. This shows the the attitude and the idea of. So from the Chinese point of view, we did everything possible.
Yeah. Showed some flexibility and some creativity and some imagination.
It's not a passport. I mean, this is we know you. We know who you are, and my student. From the Australian point of view, the Chinese must bribe the customs to let me do that. But the Chinese didn't do that. They just talk about it, mediate it, and let it happen. But this is an illustration of how the so-called rule of law by the Western countries, always accusing the Chinese don't have rule of law, and corruption and everything else. So from the Chinese point of view, there is, whatever rules you have is to serve humanity. We are humans, right? So in other words, we don't have to, okay, there are rules, but you can break them. If you don't break them, I mean that it's just too rigid. So the extent I described in Gao Village is the same thing, because if you go through a legal process, and it just serves nobody any good except the lawyers. Huh?
Yeah, absolutely. As I always point out, and I wrote about this quite a bit, Chinese governance is based on ethics, which is basically the golden rule, and then Western governance is based on morals. And the problem with morals is that my morals can definitely be different than yours. And so we're going to disagree and we're going to fight. And so, In China, it's basically do unto others what you would want them to do unto you. That's Chinese governance going back 3,000 years, and so that's why they have this kind of supple flexibility to solve solutions right there on the spot, in which I actually had the pleasure of experiencing myself several times. So. All right, you wrote about a number of instances of petty and not so petty corruption at the local level, both in business and government, and your accounts were up to about 2015, 2016. Since 2012, President Xi Jinping has fought tirelessly against corruption at all levels. As much as Mao Zedong battled it, but Xi seems to have had more success. Is this true? If so, how has Xi succeeded where Mao seemed to struggle, or did Mao have more success than we realize? And also, has corruption been reduced even more since you wrote Gao Village Revisited?
Okay. Let's look at anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence is that much or not many of the corruption practices have been stopped. Let's say, for instance, to renew a license, or to get into university examination, or to apply for a business license. Lots of them now, they are very routine, they are online, they are streamlined. There's no way you can bribe anymore. It used to be bribery. Everything is bribery. And what people see most, of course, lots of briberies are behind the doors, but what people saw most in those days is the banquets. Okay, the millions, billions of dollars of money was wasted on banquets, drinks, and all these liquors, and all these people damage people's health, and waste of money. The waste of food, and so on and so forth, and that has really stopped.
That's good.
Yeah, really
that's good. Well, and also, to be fair to China, all my research and writing has shown that the worst corruption in the world is by far in Euranglo land, and that includes, NATO, the Five Eyes, which includes Australia, New Zealand, the European Union, and Israel. So I mean, it's not just a Sino problem. It's corruption is everywhere, and of course, all you have to do is just look at the NATO and the Defense Department budgets in the West, and to see, we're not talking about a pricey dinner. We're talking about trillions of dollars, being extremely wasted and going into the back pockets. I remember there was that picture of pallets of $100 bills. I mean, pallets of $100 bills being sent to Iraq, during the invasions and occupation. No one knows what happened to that money. It just disappeared. So this is an interesting question, because you talked about this in your book, Gao Village Revisited. You wrote that you think China's, at least rural GDP, is underreported. Actually, you're not alone. Knowledgeable entities like the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis in the USA and the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, have said the same thing, usually touting a figure of 15% too low. In other words, the Chinese economy is 15% bigger than it actually is. If that's the case, then China's GDP is already bigger than the US's, not only in purchasing power parity, which has been PPP terms, which has been true since 2014, but it would also be the case in the more widely reported exchange rate terms. Tell us why you think this is true for world China, and is it even bigger now, 5 years after writing your book?
Yeah, I do think there are lots of things about GDP we have to be cautious about. You know, I'm not an economic specialist, but from what I know is that GDP is calculated, at least one of things, on transaction, right? So if you buy $100 share today and you sell $100 tomorrow, then that's $200 of GDP calculated. But in terms of value for society, there was nothing.
Mm.
There's nothing there. So GDP, and also one of the things that the people, Western and the Chinese economic rationalists or anti-Mao people talk about, or how GDP was so low in China during the era of Mao, was that there were things that were not calculated in any case. Like, for instance, I said in my first Gao Village book, the private plots. People, the villages, they don't, the collective, the commune don't produce vegetables for consumption. They produce grain, because vegetable is just produced by the farmers themselves on the private plots.
Mm-hmm.
That's at least 10 to 15% of the economy. It's never been calculated in the book, for instance. Right? And the same even now, for instance, if you look at the villages, rural economy. If you produce how much, okay, if you say how much, you can calculate the economy of rural China or Gao Village by looking at how much land is used and what it was produced and what's the price, for instance. But that's the in the book. But what's not in the book is again what they produce for their own consumption.
Mm-hmm.
It's never calculated.
Yes.
And also, if you look at, for instance, as I described in the second Gao Village book, if you look at these houses the village built, and some of them are just spectacular, inside and outside, and they, you would wonder, how do these poor people build these houses? How does it manage to do it? And that's never accounted for. We really don't, because they don't borrow money. They don't banks. Nobody will lend them. They're not in debt. There's no mortgage.
Yeah. So they can't. So no one. There's no record of it.
Yeah. That kind of the value of these houses is never calculated.
That's incredible. I was surprised to learn about the huge difference in retirement and medical, Social Security between rural and urban people. It sure seems like the country folk are getting a raw deal. Has this disparity been reduced in the last 5 years? And what are Baba Beijing's, that's my quaint name for China's governing leadership, and what are Baba Beijing's plans to deal with it in the future?
Yeah, okay. There's always two systems in China, and then I used to call two Chinas. So the rural China, urban China. The urban China was built on the Soviet model and socialist model, and working class is the leading class and respected and highly paid, and so basically the welfare system provides with free medical care, free education, free nursery, and also the work unit provides hospitals, canteens. Even today, and if you go to Tsinghua University, you go to have a lunch there, you pay 10 yuan.
Yeah, about $1.50.
Yeah. You buy this huge lunch. Seriously, 4 courses lunch.
and if the migrant workers, they have to pay $10 for one bowl of noodle.
Mm-hmm.
10 yuan for one bowl of noodle. And in Tsinghua University, you pay 10 yuan for a 4-course dinner, lunch. So he's hugely subsidized. So even today, there's a difference there.
Mm-hmm.
So the rural people, because I suppose in a way it's quite reasonable in that they were given the land. It's your land, okay? And you produce food for yourself, and you're producing everything for yourself. So the state doesn't provide for you because you are given the land. Whereas the workers were not given anything, right? They were just earning salary. So there was no welfare for the rural people, except what they call I think you mentioned about that, the 5 guarantee households.
Mm-hmm.
These disabled people without children, elderly, and they can't produce things, and the government give them some subsidies to survive, so on, that kind of things. So now that lasted until the dismantling of the collective system. And even then, of course, the migrant workers, as you say, hundreds of million people constant on the move to urban centers. If they can find work, they work. And if they can't find work, they can move back or move somewhere else, so on and so forth. And some, of course, temporarily, as you can see them sleep in the street as well. Anyway, the Foucault system is what that's divided to the urban rural China. The urban people and also the vested interested elite policymakers, because the rural people are vastly underrepresented in the People's Congress, in the party, and everything. They didn't have a voice. I mean, they still don't have much of a voice. So they don't want to abolish the Foucault system, because if the Foucault system, if the migrant workers from rural China were treated equally, then they would have this welfare system, and they don't want to give it to them.
Yeah.
So the Chinese government do realize that now, and they can't totally not listen to the urban incentive either. They can't just say, "Oh, well, let's open it." That might create lots of problems.
Yeah, well, there was just massive migration, and it would just be like social unrest.
That's right.
It's a tough situation.
So they started to allocate some funding to set up a rural social healthcare system.
Okay.
So if you you start to pay, say, 800 yuan a month.
I remember you. I remember you wrote about that. Yeah, in Gao Village Revisited.
100 yuan a month.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you are sick, serious operation, then you didn't have to pay.
Yeah. Almost like a mutual, a non-profit mutual insurance policy. You know, that's very popular here in France, by the way. There's a lot of non-profit mutual insurance companies.
So they get the villagers to contribute some, and the rest is pocket from the state.
All right. Well, that's good to hear. Another sticky issue out in the rural areas. I traveled all over China in 1990 to 1997, and working in agriculture, I saw lots of rural areas. The pollution, as you wrote, was appalling. It's just unbelievable. You said that the farmers were starting to get sensitized to the dangers of water, air, land, and chemical pollution. I noticed a huge environmental improvement when we returned to live and work in China again, 2010 to 2019. Is this positive trend continuing, stalling, or regressing? President Xi takes pride in being a, quote, blue skies, clear waters, and green mountains, end of quote, visionary. Tell us if it's getting better, going nowhere, or going backwards.
Yep. Okay, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to go, but there is some improvement. You start from the service, the civil official, like there are rubbish collectors. There didn't used to be. In rural village, you don't have rubbish collectors. You have rubbish collectors who pick up things for recycle, but not rubbish collectors to tidy up, to clean the place.
Mhm.
Now they have that. They have a designated person from each village to collect rubbish.
Yeah, you wrote about that. The poorest guy in Gao Village. Yeah.
That's right. And then they put it into a place, and they regularly they have a truck to take this rubbish away, and where they put probably dump in a place like we do in the West, but at least they don't scatter all over the place superficially for these like plastic bags and that kind of things, bottles and things like that. So that is being collected. That's being collected.
Well, they probably create a landfill someplace, and they probably, I don't know, they probably have to come up with a landfill someplace. I mean, Beijing has these massive landfills outside the 6 Ring Road.
Yeah.
You know, it's just,
Yeah. So, but the other thing they did is, of course, to stop the importing of rubbish from the West.
yeah. I've written a couple articles about that. Yeah, that was
That was
unbelievable.
hugely polluting as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of dangerous stuff, electronics and chemicals and
Yeah. And
terrible.
the other thing is they did is to clean up the air, because that is obvious and it affects the urban people as well. So they wanted to clean up their air. They did that, succeeded somewhat. Okay. Now I think the air quality has improved. Even Beijing has improved a bit.
Oh yeah, for sure. My daughter was she just graduated from Beijing Normal University in 2020, and we lived there from 2010 until 2016, and then went down to Shenzhen. And oh yeah, it's compared to the 1990s. I mean, there's no comparison.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, we used to you couldn't even see the buildings across the street in Beijing in the 90s. It was just horrific. Oh no, it's much better now. And Shenzhen is like San Francisco. I mean, it's pretty, the pollution there is just almost no air pollution at all.
But also they have worked quite a bit to stop the industrial pollution.
Yeah.
The private small ones, low tech ones, they gradually phase them out.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was effective as well. And like even private mining coal and dumping everything everywhere, and they act together to stop that.
Yeah, and Shanxi and Inner Mongolia and Shanxi.
Yeah, they've worked quite a bit to stop that. I think there's some effect on that. However, and also the thing I mentioned specifically in the second Gao Village book is that this is very important, that the people are made aware that pollution is an issue.
Yeah.
It was never an issue. The Gao villagers never thought it was an issue. Now they were made aware.
Yeah, they're sensitized to the effects.
That's right.
Yeah.
And just that to the effect also because the economy was, the life was Spartan, and it was for survival. And when you just work for survival, who care for the environment, for instance, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's that. Now, finally, this is the thing they have not come to terms to what to do, is the chemicals in farming.
The problem all over the world. It's just the pollution. We'll look at the Gulf of Mexico, all the effluent coming down the Mississippi River, and there's massive dead zones out in the Gulf of Mexico where the phosphates and the nitrates are poisoning the water. There's algae blooms and oil refineries on the Texas Arkansas border. You drive up that valley and you'll get cancer, and the people there have cancer. I mean, it's not just China. It's a huge problem all over the world. It's just probably better propagandized in the West than it is in China, but it's a massive problem.
A massive problem, yeah, it's a massive problem.
Much has been made of Baba Beijing investing over $100 billion across the countryside to eliminate extreme poverty in the last 5 years, and succeeding in 2020. My wife and I saw very poor rural villages. This was from when we moved back we saw them in the 1990s, of course, but in 2010, we saw poor rural villages that probably were on that list in places like Yunnan and Fujian. Is it all hype? Are those villages still there, or has the Mao era goal of Wubaohu, which is to provide clothing, food, shelter, medical care, and burials, has that now been taken care of, at least for in eliminating extreme poverty?
I actually, for Gao Village, I actually described in detail. The two families. One is the poorest family, Lati, and the other one is the cousins, marriage of cousins, and produced the result of which was a couple of disabled children. And I involved in both cases to argue for them to get some help, and eventually it bore fruit. So the two disabled people had something like, I think it was 200 a month help from the state, and Lati got his poor family subsidies as well. So there were programs even before this was announced about the ridding of the poverty thing. Now, when you talk about the remote areas like Yunnan and Sichuan and Shanxi, where the land was not fertile, was mountainous, you can't reach by transport, you can't sell anything, and that kind of things. Some of them got migrated. They moved the whole village out of. Moved to some other places, and that's been done. I know that. Whether people are happy with that, I don't know. I mean, people usually would like to have a home village. You would like to stay there, whatever. And it's their culture, it's their identity, their life. But whether this kind of dramatic way of doing it is good, I mean, that's debatable. I don't know. But the other, there are issues like whether the what do you mean by poverty, and how do you mean that poverty is gone? And of course, as I described in the second Gao Village book, according to the Chinese definition of poverty, there was no poverty in China, in Gao Village. Everybody was above that, even including the two families that were unfortunate that I described. And their life was not that bad. I mean, to be fair. And if you think of these real poor families that we see in Africa, in India, Gao villages are doing very well, really.
Yeah. Everything's relative.
Now, some of these remote areas and some of what they did, I don't know. I haven't done research, and there is discussion that whether it's sustainable, even if it is temporary that the issue seems to be resolved. But will they go back to poverty in a couple of years? is a sustainable way of life, and that is an issue.
Yeah. Well, that would be your next book. What would have happened if Hu Yaobang had continued to lead China after 1978? And for those of you who don't know who Yaobang was, he was the designated leader to take over as president, party secretary of China after Mao died after 1970, and Deng's drastic reforms had not been implemented. I read that the Cultural Revolution grew quite stable after the first tumultuous year, and economic growth and development were doing very well. Also, the Mao era was already starting a number of market and policy reforms to continue improving the economy and raising the material lives of the people. What would China be today if all of this had continued? Would China be a colossal continent-sized North Korea or something altogether different?
Well, if we are bound, well, to lead China, you mean?
Yeah, if Hu Yaobang was left to continue and, along Mao's path, and Deng did not implement his drastic reforms, what do you think would have happened?
You mean Hua Guofeng?
Yeah.
Not
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Hua Guofeng. Yeah. Exactly. I'm sorry.
Yeah. If Hua Guofeng allowed to continue to lead instead of Deng Xiaoping, that is, of course, this is very hypothetical. We never know, and also Hua Guofeng might change because of circumstances. But many people, rural people that I know of, they would say if Hua Guofeng were to lead China along the ways, although there might be some changes of the Maoist policies, and they would be better off. Rural people.
And what do you think what do the villagers say about it? What do they think would have happened if it had continued?
Well, they would say the kind of material life they enjoy now, they would enjoy under Hua Guofeng's leadership as well. And what is better is that it will be better social trust. It'll be less corruption. It will be people would be nicer to each other.
Yeah. When we were there in the '90s, man, it was crazy. It was wild East Buckaroo. It was dog eat dog. It was not a relaxing place to live and work. It was really crazy.
North Korea, and people were saying North Korea, but China would never be like a North Korea.
Yeah.
Even during the Mao, Zhou Enlai welcomed Nixon and to visit China, and China was ready to have a relationship with the United States of America in the early 1970s. And Hua Guofeng, of course, when he was in power, he used to already imported what's it called? He was accused of being a small great leap forward because he spent so much money, foreign currencies, to import chemical plant
fertilizer plants.
Yeah, 10 of them, and that's what helped later agriculture. So he was not a person who wanted to close China anyway, who wanted to be hostile to the West. I don't think so.
Yeah, that's why he reached out. He was reaching out to the United States and Europe back in the 1930s. He was trying to build bridges with them all the way up until the 40s and the 50s.
I wanted to visit the United States of America. Want to swim in the Mississippi?
Yeah, they wouldn't give him that PR opportunity. Tell us about China's New Left, which you represented in a never published Wall Street Journal interview. and that you added at the end of your book as an informative appendix. It's easy to see why they buried it, and it's just, you had some really interesting quotes about how a Chinese woman does not have to carry a Louis Vuitton bag to walk the talk. A Chinese man does not have to drive a Porsche to demonstrate his existence. For us to advocate these kinds of ideas is not Chinese nationalism, but arguments for common sense decency and human existence. And then another really intriguing quote is, I do find that many of the ideas, some of which were advocated and some practiced during the Cultural Revolution, are not just Maoist, but actually postmodern and not only Chinese, but universal. This is something that is very hard to understand, not only for hardcore anti-communist Cold Warriors, but also the Eurocentric humanists of the Enlightenment tradition. The New Left has been looking for an alternative, but has not gone very far. And the last one that really intrigued me, those were the two that I had. Would you like to just say something about those? Because I thought they were really good.
Yeah. Well, I think people label me as one of the New Left. But of course, the most famous one is Wang Hui of Tsinghua University, the New Left, and Cui Ziyuan, again of Tsinghua University, and Wang Shaoguang of Hong Kong, Chinese University of Hong Kong. I don't usually ally with any political factions, but I do think the idea of New Left actually is more in line with Western Enlightenment and individual values than the economic rationalists in China today or in the West. The betterment of humanity is not just superficial things. We know that, like you need basic things like shelter, warmth, and clothes and food. And once that is satisfied, lots of money, or possession of things, do not make you necessarily happy or happier. So it's all these Western luxury goods and also this possession is hyped up by capitalists with propaganda and brainwashing. And consumerism and commercialism. So all this, it's something that the Chinese New Left do not like, which is, I suppose, the same with lots of Westerners. The only thing, the difference is that the Westerners have a patronizing attitudes towards China, even the left ones. Right? Even the left ones.
Big time. Big time.
That's what we don't like.
Yeah. Very, very patronizing.
Yeah.
Well, listen, this has been a wonderful conversation. Any closing comments? And do you have more writing and research projects in the pipeline, Mobo?
Well, this is interesting because on the one hand, I am very disillusioned with Western academia and the scholarship because of the ugly turn against China, whether left or right scholars. I think it is racist, but they don't want to say it.
Of course it's racist. The yellow barrel.
And therefore, because I used to have very romantic idea of Western scholarship of pursuing the truth, and I'm disillusioned with that. But on the other hand, I still want to contribute to the well-being of people, and therefore I would like to have, like in Australia, for instance, it's interesting because it seems to me to be absurd. This country, Australia, who benefits the most from China's development, and it's so jumping up and down against China, which is just it's baffling. I don't. So I'm trying to understand that. I'm trying to get some couple of people to organize a workshop to entitled "Different Histories, Shared Future," to see if we can get together some ideas that we can work. We should work together instead of getting into this Cold War. Even that they're drumming up wars with China. It's just amazing how things could go. I mean, it's just a few years ago it was such a rosy picture, and then just suddenly just so nasty.
Yeah, I agree, but unfortunately, that seems to be the modus operandi of empire. I think that was probably true with the Romans, and it sure was true with the British Empire, and definitely with the American Empire. They just they just have lizard brains. They just reptile brains. They have no game plan other than just domination and control and exploitation and war. It's a disease. It's a disease in the West. It's just the way the West has been for 3,000 years. I mean, nothing's changed.
I mean, they always say China is aggressive, especially under Xi Jinping. I haven't seen anything that Xi Jinping is really aggressive so far. I mean, the jury is still out. If you look at Deng Xiaoping, for instance, Deng Xiaoping was responsible for the Tiananmen events, right?
Mm-hmm.
Moving tank into the streets to crack down on his own people. It was Deng Xiaoping, not Xi Jinping or Mao Zedong. And it was Deng Xiaoping who launched the war
in Vietnam
in 1979. But everybody laughed at Deng Xiaoping.
Well, nor Jiang Zemin, nor Hu Jintao. It was just yeah, exactly.
And they always say, "Oh, how bad Xi Jinping is." Or what? What did he do?
Yeah. He's made China bigger, stronger, faster, and more advanced and more peaceful, and that's why the West can't stand him. So anyway, well, listen, Mobo, this has been really wonderful. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to end this. I have no idea where I'm going to find this video because I've never used Zoom before. I guess it's recording. I guess it's gonna, when I hit the stop button, it's going to download someplace.
Yeah.
So
see if the recording quality is good.
And anyway, lovely to have you on the show again. We've had today Dr. Mobo Gao, Adelaide, Australia. We talked about his last book, Gao Village Revisited. This is the second time he's been on China Rising Radio Sinoland. I will put all the links for his 4 books on the interview page. I encourage you to read his work. It's the real China. It's not the scar literature. The Dicotter and Johnny Halliday and Wang Sung and all. It's not all that Mao's private doctor and all these other screeds to trash and destroy Mao's image and China's image and socialism's image and communism's image. Mobo lived it. He was there, so he knows what he's talking about. So I really encourage, and now he gets to compare it because now he's been in Australia, so he can do some comparisons. So thank you so much for being on the show, Mobo. And as soon as I get this up, I'll let you know about it. Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
And we always stay in touch anyway. We've become really good email friends over the years. So it's I'm sure we'll be in touch. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So I'm going to click stop.